Okay, welcome to the complete guide to Google Analytics 4. This video will summarize Chapter 4, Before You Implement, How to Plan, which was written by Search Discovery's own Tim Wilson. Tim has been working with digital data full-time since 2001. He's a longtime creator of pragmatic content for analysts and marketers, including he co-hosts the bi-weekly Analytics Power Hour, and he is the co-creator of Dartistics.com, which is a site that encourages analysts to learn the R programming language. Tim, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining. So your topic is before you implement, how to plan your implementation of Google Analytics 4. And I will start off by saying I have had a few instances where this went very poorly for me. I'm certainly guilty of sitting down and starting to create tags for a client or for the company that I was working for. And then at the end of the project, having questions like, this project isn't over because we still have things that we need, or how do I pull this report that I expect to be able to pull, but I never told you that, and so you didn't prepare for that kind of thing. So planning, I'm familiar from my own mistakes, is incredibly critical to an analytics implementation. Just to get started, I'd love to throw out what is involved with the planning process.
I kind of wonder how much you can actually ever truly understand and appreciate the importance of planning until you've been burned by not having a good plan. I mean, I tend to think of it as like an ounce of planning is worth a pound of prevented future headaches. The problem is they're not kind of fun and exciting ounces of planning, but it is, I think, so critical so you don't find yourself kind of in a tough spot far down the road and wishing, oh, I should have caught that in the planning. So
right.
When I think of planning, it's kind of a multifaceted thing. It includes kind of really understanding what your current state is, figuring out what's being used now. It's kind of a research project. Who's using what and for where is the data flowing, what's being used, what's useful, what is not useful. That's kind of a research part of it. Then there is kind of doing some measurement planning and developing detailed business requirements, really thinking through what am I going to need to be able to get out, what needs to be able to come out really easily, what are the corner cases, figuring out how you're going to handle the legacy data, because for some period of time, there's going to be a need for data before the implementation being combined with data after the implementation. So figuring that out. And then really part of the planning also kind of falls under the change management, the communication and the training, kind of the communicate early, communicate often. All of that sort of falls under the umbrella of planning, and dropping the ball on that will almost definitely wind up causing some real heartburn farther down the path.
Right. Yeah, so it's a little bit of making sure you know what's important to the business and making sure you can answer those questions and documenting everything so that you can have a little CYA, honestly, at the end of the project to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what we're doing. In your article that you wrote for the complete guide to Google Analytics 4, you also referenced technical debt. So I do want to talk a little bit about that. Can you help us define it and talk about what kind of problems it can create and how a business can determine if they have this problem?
Sure. And I was kind of into my career before I think I ever came across the term technical debt. We were having some discussions internally where somebody who's not as deeply into the analytics world was asking like, well, what's technical debt? Do people understand what that is? And it's one of those that if you don't know what technical debt is, you're probably in a great spot. It means you're not dealing with a lot of it, but it's a pretty common term in IT circles, where it's basically kind of the legacy junk that's in any system or in your implementation. So if you've had Universal Analytics for years, it's possible that you've got Google Tag Manager triggering off of functionality that no longer even exists on the site. And that sort of clutter in the system or workarounds, or there was DOM scraping because in the interest of expediency, we didn't kind of do this through the data layer. All of that is sort of things that were done at one time for one reason. But if you're still dealing with saying, well, this is a pain, every time somebody asks me to do something, I worry that I'm going to break the system, or I know it's going to be a headache, that's a good indication that you've got technical debt that you're going to be dealing with.
Right. Yeah, and we're all probably guilty of creating a little technical debt here and there.
I think there'll always be some. It's when that's like the bulk of your effort is technical debt. It's so hard to do something that should be simple. And that's where a new implementation, part of your plan can be like, we're going to address it. We're going to do some things right. We're going to wipe out some of that technical debt. We're going to invest in doing that.
Yeah. Okay. My next question gets out of the technical side and goes back to the business objective side and defining the business goals. So can you describe the difference between a top-down approach to planning versus a bottom-up approach?
Sure. And I've got visual aids for this because I really think you should be doing both. And that's kind of the ideal. Top down is where it's kind of where measurement plans, where we see measurement planning fall. So if you've got different stakeholder groups, it's really figuring out what is most important to them that we're able to capture. How are they looking at success for the business? So it's kind of a little bit of a hierarchy, nailing down for each stakeholder group, what are kind of the business outcomes that the website or the mobile app supports. From that, saying, how do they measure if they are achieving that business outcome? Those are your key performance indicators. And then one step below that is, I know what my KPIs are. What are the drivers of that kind of mathematically? If I'm really looking at if online revenue is a KPI, well, I know that my cart conversion rate is one of the drivers of that. So we don't want to go nuts with the drivers, but this is saying in the business terms, making sure we understand what they care about, figuring out what kind of the necessary data needs are there, and making sure that the implementation supports those. So there's a link in the chapter in the book that links to just a pretty simple little spreadsheet. And if you need to add some columns or adjust this, that's totally fine. These are not like totally sacred, but it really works through that hierarchy of what's my desired outcome, what are the metrics that I'm going to use. I've got a handful of desired outcomes, a handful of metrics. Some of those metrics are going to be KPIs, some should be drivers. It's the way to check if you've got 27 KPIs, maybe aren't setting the bar in the right spot. Then asking, how am I going to want to break those KPIs down? Usually I'm going to want to break it down by my channel grouping. I'm going to want to be able to break it down by device category. And then while figuring that out, if anything crops up that's kind of unique or special or weird, you make a note of it. So that's top down, which really should be done along with, these are complementary with the bottom-up exercise. The bottom-up exercise is much less structured. It's, what do you want to be able to get out of the tool? What data do you need? It's much more of a brainstorming exercise. There's kind of no wrong answers. If somebody says, I want to be able to track global nav clicks and what page they were on, go ahead and capture that. So that's a second tab in that same workbook with a bunch of those kind of micro questions. And we've got this populated with 80 or 90 of them. And in our like Search Discovery's full catalog, we have almost 1,000 because we've got some that are specific for different verticals, but just to not make it overwhelming. And it's really meant just to be inspiration. So you can start saying, oh, do any of these spark other things that we're going to want to be able to track? Then you can prioritize those, capture sort of what dimensions and metrics will be involved there. And both of these go together. They complement each other because when you get to designing your solution, this will actually make sure that you are able to vet the solution design and say, am I able to meet these requirements? Rather than waiting until after you've implemented and get to the scenario you described, Ken, where somebody says, well, I thought I'd be able to see X or Y. And you're like, oh, shoot, we didn't actually plan for that.
Right. Well, that's extremely thorough, and there's a lot to think about. I mean, just reading through the things that were in your list, I saw a lot of questions, and it made me think there are probably some clients out there who are thinking to themselves, I'm not sure what the right questions are to ask. So what advice do you have for someone who, they don't feel like they know enough to make a plan? What's the best way to get started?
So it really starts with thinking about the business. So I would say don't think about the tool. That Google Analytics 4 is awesome, but it is just a tool, and really need to think about the business. There's a longtime guy in the digital analytics industry named Adam Greco, who for years has proposed this thought experiment of saying, imagine that you came in tomorrow morning and your website had been shut off entirely, and you have to justify why you want to turn it back on. That is the business need for your website. And if you start with that experiment and start nailing down why your website or your app exists, then that's getting you to what are the business outcomes that you need. And really, if you've got that clear in your mind, the what I might want to look at and what data I might need should come from that. Like if you have no idea, well, you need to think a little bit harder and put your business hat on, and then
Yeah.
everything else flows from that.
Awesome. Great advice. Well, Tim, that's all the questions I have. Thank you for joining and really appreciate the chapter that you wrote.
Sure thing.